She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. When the steaming cup hit her chest, the crowd gasped, but no one moved. Just another morning at a roadside diner. Another moment that would be forgotten by noon. To him, she was invisible, a quiet black woman who wouldn't dare speak. But what he didn't know was that her silence wasn't weakness. It was history. It was power waiting in disguise. Because years later, the man who once mocked her would kneel, not in apology, but in recognition. Before we begin this intense story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Your support keeps powerful stories like this alive. The morning began like any other. Quiet, predictable, wrapped in the kind of routine that keeps life steady. Margaret Lewis preferred it that way. At 56, she had long learned that peace was not given. It was earned, guarded, and sometimes fought for in silence. She lived on the edge of a small southern town, the kind where everyone knew your name but not your story. Her small house sat at the end of Willow Creek Road, its white paint peeling slightly from years of summer heat. The front porch was lined with fading flower pots, each holding a stubborn bloom that refused to die, much like her. Every morning Margaret woke before dawn. The world, still half asleep, felt gentler then. She'd brew a pot of black coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen as she packed lunches for the nursing home staff. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. She'd been a cleaner for 28 years, the kind of worker everyone noticed only when something went wrong. She moved slowly, her hands weathered but steady, her movements practiced and calm. Sometimes she'd hum an old gospel tune, her voice soft enough to blend with the hum of the refrigerator. There was grace in her routine, not the loud, showy kind, but the quiet endurance that comes from surviving a world that rarely noticed you. By 7:30, she'd step out into the cool morning air, uniform crisp, lunch bag in hand, and begin her short walk to the bus stop. The road curved gently past the church, the post office, and the diner, a narrow neon-signed place called Earl's Cafe, where truckers stopped for cheap coffee and familiar faces. She didn't go there often, not because she wasn't welcome, but because she knew what welcome really meant in places like that. A polite smile, a seat near the door, eyes that looked, then looked away. Still, that morning, something nudged her inside. Maybe it was the sudden rain that began to fall, or the ache in her knees that begged for a short rest. Perhaps it was just one of those quiet twists of fate that change everything without warning. She entered the cafe, gently shaking the rain from her jacket. The chatter dimmed just slightly, not silence, but a pause, like a skipped beat in a familiar song. She felt it, but she was used to it. She took a seat near the corner booth, the one closest to the window, and folded her hands neatly on the table. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, came over. "Coffee?" she asked. Margaret nodded. "Please." The warmth of the cup soon found her palms, a small comfort against the chill outside. She watched the world through. The glass, cars passing, rain streaking the windows, people rushing through their own small stories. For a moment she felt invisible, but not in a painful way. More like a quiet observer of life, content in her corner. What she didn't notice was the man at the counter. Officer Daniel Price had been on the force for nearly 12 years. To the town, he was dependable, the kind of officer who kept order and knew how to talk to people. But those words often hid something sharper. Behind the uniform and easy grin was a man raised on quiet prejudice, the kind that hides behind jokes, habits, and a belief that some people should know their place. That morning, he'd stopped by Earl's Cafe like he always did after his shift. He was tired, frustrated, still carrying the bitterness of a domestic call that went wrong the night before. When he saw Margaret sitting alone in her corner, something in him twisted. A petty, misplaced urge to remind the world who had power and who didn't. He didn't know her. Didn't care to. All he saw was someone easy to belittle, someone too quiet to fight back. Margaret, meanwhile, sat lost in thought. Her son, Isaiah, had just been accepted into the State Police Academy. She'd cried when she got the letter, proud tears, though mixed with the ache of worry. The idea of her only child stepping into a uniform she'd spent a lifetime learning to fear was both beautiful and terrifying. She'd raised Isaiah alone after her husband passed. She'd cleaned floors, skipped meals, worked double shifts, all to give him a life where respect wasn't something he had to beg for. Every hardship, every insult swallowed in silence had built toward that dream, a son who could walk in any room and be treated as an equal. She sipped her coffee and smiled faintly, imagining his graduation day. At that same moment, Officer Price laughed at something one of the regulars said, a low, mocking chuckle that filled the small space. Margaret glanced up, briefly catching his reflection in the diner's mirror. He was looking right at her, not in curiosity, but in that long, lingering way that makes your stomach tighten. She looked away. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the window in restless rhythm. The smell of fried bacon and cheap coffee mixed in the air. For a few minutes, everything stood still. The sound of forks clinking, boots scuffing against tile, conversation rising and falling like waves. Then came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, measured. They stopped beside her table. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. She knew that sound. The weight of authority, the presence that fills space like a shadow. He stood there for a moment, cup in hand, the coffee steaming between them. Margaret focused on her hands. Still, calm, folded neatly on the table. The silence stretched. "Rainy morning," he said casually. His tone was light, but there was something beneath it, the kind of tone that asks for submission, not conversation. She nodded faintly. "Yes, it is." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Outside, a bus groaned to a stop near the corner. Her bus. Margaret glanced toward it, then back at her cup. She didn't want trouble. She never did. But trouble, in towns like this, didn't always come with reason. Sometimes it came with a uniform and a smirk. The waitress returned, glancing nervously between them. "You need anything else, hun?" she asked Margaret, her voice a little too bright, a little too quick. Margaret shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Price watched her closely, the corner of his mouth twitching in quiet amusement. The power imbalance in that tiny space was suffocating, a battle fought entirely in silence. To anyone else it looked harmless, a casual interaction, nothing worth remembering. But for Margaret, it was the familiar tightening of the chest, the sound of unspoken judgment pressing in from all sides. As she stood to leave, reaching for her coat, her sleeve brushed against his arm. It was accidental, innocent. But to him, it was enough. A slow, deliberate smirk spread across his face. Margaret stepped out into the rain. She didn't notice that evening when she got home, she found the front porch light flickering, the old bulb fading against the damp air. She stood there for a while, staring into the distance. The events at the diner played again in her mind, each moment sharper than before. She wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of carrying the weight of other people's cruelty like an unwanted inheritance. Inside, a framed photograph sat on the table. Isaiah, in his academy uniform, smiling proudly. She ran her fingers over the glass, her chest tightening with quiet love and fear all at once. "Make me proud, baby," she whispered. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The next morning would begin just as quietly. Another shift, another cup of coffee, another day to endure. But beneath that calm surface, something unseen was building, the tension of years, of disrespect, of restraint, waiting for a moment to break. And that moment was closer than anyone knew, because soon, a single cruel act, one that began with a cup of coffee, would ripple far beyond the walls of a small-town diner. It would test everything Margaret had taught her son about dignity, justice, and restraint. It would force an entire town to confront the reflection it had long ignored. And when it happened, no one would remember the rain, only the silence before it. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still carried its memory, damp, heavy, and a little colder than usual. Margaret stepped out of her house, umbrella in hand, her uniform freshly pressed, her lunch neatly packed. She moved with the same measured calm that had carried her through years of unseen battles, each day an act of quiet resilience. The world around her looked the same, but something within her felt unsettled. Maybe it was the way. The town seemed to hum louder lately, conversations drifting toward tension she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the echo of that officer's smirk from the diner, a small cruelty, yet sharp enough to linger. At the bus stop, she watched the road glisten under the weak morning light. The pavement shimmered like glass, mirroring the silhouettes of passing cars. Her reflection, faint and blurred, stared back at her from a puddle, tired eyes framed by strength that refused to break. When the bus arrived, she climbed aboard quietly, greeting the driver with a nod. The same faces occupied the same seats, as they always did. An old man with a folded newspaper, a young mother rocking her baby, two teens whispering over shared headphones. No one spoke much. Morning rides had their own kind of silence. As the bus rolled past Earl's Cafe, Margaret glanced out the window. The neon sign still buzzed weakly in the daylight, its red glow flickering. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of Officer Price, leaning against his patrol car, coffee cup in hand. Their eyes didn't meet, but the memory of his smirk came rushing back. She turned away quickly, her hand tightening around her bag. At work, the day unfolded like any other, the smell of disinfectant, the squeak of shoes on linoleum floors, the steady rhythm of her mop gliding down the hall. Margaret preferred this kind of order, the small, dependable tasks that didn't judge or speak back. Her co-workers were polite enough, though distant. They spoke to her when they needed something, thanked her when they remembered, but otherwise, she existed in the periphery, essential but unseen. That afternoon, she was asked to clean the administrator's office, a rare request. As she worked, the local news played softly on a small radio near the window. A reporter's voice cut through the quiet. In other news, Officer Daniel Price was commended for his swift response in yesterday's downtown altercation. Margaret froze, hand mid-air, the sound echoing against her ribs. His name, the same man. She turned down the volume and stood for a moment, staring out at the world beyond the glass, the parking lot, the busy street. People coming and going without knowing how deeply one moment can scar another. She tried to shake it off. But some things cling like smoke, faint but impossible to ignore. That evening she came home to find Isaiah sitting on the porch steps, still in his academy uniform. The sight of him always softened her. The sharp lines of his jacket, the badge still temporary but shining bright under the porch light. He looked up and smiled. "Hey, Ma," Margaret smiled back, weary but warm. "You're early," he shrugged. "Training ended sooner today. They're pairing us with local departments next week. Field experience." Her heart sank just slightly. "Local?" He nodded. "Yeah, they said maybe here in town. Maybe with county officers." Her hand stilled on the doorknob. She didn't say his name. Didn't want to bring the thought to life. The image of Officer Price standing outside Earl's cafe flickered in her mind. Instead, she forced a small smile. "That's good, baby. Real good." They ate dinner quietly, as they always did, the clatter of silverware filling the spaces where words sometimes failed. Isaiah talked about drills, report writing, and his upcoming exams. His voice carried excitement, but beneath it, she heard something else, a desire to prove himself, to belong in a place that hadn't always made room for him. After he went to bed, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was still, the only sound the steady tick of the wall clock. She stared at Isaiah's Academy ID card lying beside the sugar jar, his young face confident, unaware of how cruel the world could be. She whispered a prayer, not for success, but for safety. Days passed. The rain returned. Life moved with the same routine rhythm, but the tension around town began to shift. Subtle, like a low hum under every conversation. At the grocery store, Margaret noticed how the cashier avoided her eyes, how customers spoke more softly when she was near. Small things, too small to name but heavy enough to feel. It wasn't new, but it was getting worse. One morning, while sweeping the nursing home hallway, she overheard two nurses talking by the break room door. Their voices were low, but words like incident and video slipped through. "Did you see it?" one whispered. "That woman?" She started yelling at the officer. "People don't know how to act anymore," the other sighed. "Yeah, but still." Throwing coffee? What did she expect? Margaret's hands froze on the broom handle. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She didn't understand. Not at first. But as she stepped closer, she saw the video playing on one of their phones. The screen showed a blurred diner floor, a uniformed officer standing near a booth, and a woman's hand trembling as coffee spilled. Her stomach turned cold. Her own hands. Her own sleeve. Her own face, caught in a single humiliating frame. It wasn't the truth. It wasn't even the full story, but it didn't matter. In a world built on assumptions, a single image could erase everything else. That night she couldn't sleep. The internet, something she rarely touched, became a storm of words she couldn't escape. The video had spread locally, then further. Comment sections filled with strangers dissecting her existence like a rumor. She provoked him. Why didn't she just leave? She looks like trouble. Each word felt like a fresh cut, invisible but deep. Isaiah noticed the change in her the next morning. "Ma, what's wrong?" he asked, frowning as he tied his boots. "Nothing," she said softly. "Just tired." He studied her face, unconvinced. But he let it go, pressing a kiss to her forehead before heading out. She hadn't stepped inside since that morning, but it didn't matter. Her silence had already been rewritten into a story she didn't recognize. Officer Price, meanwhile, seemed to bask in the attention. The video had painted him as calm, restrained, a hero maintaining order. In town, people nodded to him a little longer now, thanked him a little louder. He smiled, knowing exactly what they believed, but deep down, beneath that confident grin, something began to shift. An unease he couldn't name. The kind that comes when you realize your smallest cruelty has started to grow teeth. For Margaret, the days became a blur of endurance. She went to work, came home, and tried to pretend the world was the same. But it wasn't. Even her bus route felt different now. Eyes watching, whispers following. Once, a young man muttered, under his breath as she passed, "Ain't that the lady from the video?" She kept walking, head high, but her chest burned. By the time she reached her front porch that evening, she could barely hold back the tears. The porch light flickered again, the same weak bulb, the same fragile glow. She sat on the steps, rain tapping gently against the railing. For the first time in years, she felt small. Not invisible, but diminished. Like the world had shrunk her down to that single frame in the diner. Inside, her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. When she answered, the voice on the other end was firm but calm. "Ms. Lewis? This is Captain Harris from the State Police. Your son is scheduled to begin field training tomorrow. He's been assigned to the local precinct under Officer Daniel Price." Her breath caught. The words echoed like thunder. She thanked the captain quietly, her voice steady. But when the call ended, the silence in the room felt unbearable. The world seemed to tilt slightly, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The man who humiliated her would now train her son. She sat in that silence for a long time, the sound of the rain soft against the windows. In her lap, her hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the storm of everything she'd swallowed for so many years. She thought of Isaiah, his kindness, his hope, his belief that the badge could stand for something better. And she thought of Price, a man who wore that same badge like a weapon. The contrast was unbearable. Outside, lightning cracked across the sky, lighting the road in fleeting white. For a brief moment, the reflection of her face appeared in the window, strong, weary, and unbroken. Somewhere deep inside her, something began to shift too. Not anger, not revenge, but a quiet knowing. A sense that silence this time might no longer be enough. The morning sun broke through a restless sky, pale, uncertain, and streaked with gray. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water that had long gone cold. On the table behind her sat Isaiah's uniform cap, perfectly creased, polished to a mirror shine. Today, he would start field training. Under him. Her chest tightened as she tried to breathe past the weight of that thought. Isaiah came downstairs, the sound of his boots soft but sure against the wooden floor. He looked sharp, confident, proud, the way only a young man standing on the edge of his dream could be. "Wish me luck, Ma," he said, fastening his badge with careful hands. She turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't need luck. Just keep your eyes open." He frowned, sensing the undercurrent. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she lied softly. "Go on now. Make me proud." He leaned down and hugged her, and for a moment she closed her eyes, holding him tighter than she meant to. The smell of his uniform, starch, polish, and hope reminded her of her late husband's early days in the service. "Be safe," she whispered. "Always," he said, grinning as he walked out the door. The moment it closed behind him, her shoulders sank. The world outside had never scared her this much. The local precinct buzzed with the energy of a Monday morning. Phones rang, officers exchanged reports, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Officer Daniel Price leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee, his usual ritual. When the captain walked in, everyone straightened up. "Price," the captain said. "Meet your trainee. Officer in training, Isaiah Lewis." Isaiah stepped forward, extending a hand with polite confidence. "Sir." Price looked up, recognizing the last name before the face. Lewis. It took him half a second to place it. Then he saw the eyes. Calm, steady, familiar. He didn't shake the hand right away. A flicker of unease crossed his expression, gone as quickly as it came. "Well," he said, smirking faintly. "Let's see if you can keep up." Isaiah smiled politely. "I'll do my best, sir." And just like that, the day began, ordinary to everyone else, but loaded with unspoken tension for the two men. By mid-morning, they were on patrol, driving the quiet streets that stitched through town. Price talked too much, the way people do when they're trying to prove control. He lectured Isaiah about respect, command, and knowing when to show authority. Isaiah nodded, taking notes, absorbing everything like a sponge. But as they passed Earl's Cafe, Price fell strangely quiet. The neon sign still, flickered weakly, and through the window the same waitress refilled cups for the morning crowd. Isaiah noticed the tension in Price's jaw. "You okay, sir?" Price forced a chuckle. "Yeah, just a place with some history, that's all." Isaiah didn't push, but something about the man's tone stayed with him. Meanwhile, Margaret went about her day in slow motion. She cleaned, folded, cooked, anything to keep her hands busy. But her mind kept drifting to the image of Isaiah beside the man who had humiliated her. She thought about calling the precinct, telling someone, warning him. But what would she say? That an officer poured coffee on her and got away with it? That she feared for her son's spirit, not his safety? No one would listen. Not to her. Instead, she prayed that Price would never realize whose son Isaiah truly was. But truth, like light through cracks, has a way of slipping through. Later that week, While grabbing lunch with other officers, Price overheard one of them mention Isaiah's family. "Yeah, his mom works over at the nursing home. Single mom. Real quiet lady." Something in Price's chest went cold. He leaned forward casually. "Lewis, you said? Nursing home?" "Yeah," another officer said. "You've probably seen her around. Margaret Lewis, I think." The name hit him like a shard of ice. The woman. The video. The coffee. He sat back slowly, forcing a smirk to hide the rising discomfort. The others didn't notice, but inside, the past came rushing back in sharp fragments. Her calm defiance, the way she didn't flinch, the heat of spilled coffee down his arm, the laughter from the booth behind him. That day had haunted him more than he'd ever admit, not because of guilt, but because of how small it had made him feel. And now her son was under his command. Over the next few days, Price's demeanor shifted. The easy jokes, the casual tone, they turned sharp, almost mocking. He began correcting Isaiah more harshly, interrupting him during calls, pointing out mistakes that weren't really mistakes. Isaiah tried to stay professional. "Yes, sir. Understood. Won't happen again." But inside, doubt began to form. He couldn't understand why the man seemed to dislike him, why every effort was met with suspicion. Then one afternoon, while filling out a report, Price muttered under his breath, "Guess your mama never taught you about following orders." Isaiah looked up, startled. "Sir?" Price smiled a little too easily. "Nothing. Just talking." The comment lodged itself in Isaiah's chest. Something in the way Price said "mama," stretched heavy, told him it wasn't random. That evening, Isaiah came home quieter than usual. Margaret noticed immediately. "Long day?" she asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just getting used to people." She studied him, her heart aching. "You sure everything's all right?" He nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'll figure it out." But that night, long after she went to bed, Isaiah sat awake at the table. The flickering porch light cast uneven shadows across his face as he replayed the day. The tone, the stares, the unspoken tension. Somewhere deep down, something whispered, "This isn't just training." The next morning, everything changed. They were called to a routine disturbance, a minor complaint at Earl's Cafe. Isaiah didn't think much of it. But Price's lips curled slightly when he heard the location. "Let's go." The drive was silent. Rain misted against the windshield, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and light. When they arrived, the cafe looked almost empty. Just a few regulars, a waitress, and the hum of the old coffee machine. The manager pointed toward a booth. "Nothing major, officers. Just a mix-up with payment. She's been here before." When Isaiah turned, his heart nearly stopped. It was his mother. Margaret sat quietly in the corner booth, her eyes wide as she saw who walked through the door. Her son, and the man beside him. For a moment, time seemed to collapse. Price froze too, realizing the impossible intersection of fate standing before him. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence as if daring her to speak. Margaret's lips trembled. "No problem," she whispered. But the air between them said otherwise. Thick, electric, heavy with all the words left unsaid. Isaiah looked from one to the other, confusion turning to dread. "You two know each other?" Neither answered. Then Price stepped closer, the faintest trace of a smirk pulling at his mouth. "You could say that." Something inside Isaiah snapped. His mother's silence, Price's tone, the looks he'd gotten all week. It all began to make sense. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think I should handle this." Price's eyes narrowed. "That's not how this works, rookie." The cafe had gone silent. Even the hum of the coffee machine seemed to fade. Margaret stood slowly, her hands shaking, not from fear this time, but from the weight of finally being seen. "Isaiah," she said softly, "let it go." But Isaiah couldn't. "What did he do?" he demanded, turning to her. "What happened, Ma?" Price's jaw tightened. "You might want to be careful with your tone, officer." And just like that, the illusion of order shattered. No one remembers exactly who moved first. Some say Price reached for his coffee. Others say Isaiah stepped forward. But what the crowd remembered most was the sound, a sharp crack of a cup hitting the counter, the splash of hot liquid, the gasp that followed. Coffee spilled again, but this time, not by her hands. Isaiah stood frozen, chest heaving, eyes wide with disbelief. His mother's face mirrored his, horror, pain, and something else, realization. It was happening all over again, the humiliation. The eyes, the silence. But this time she wasn't alone. Someone recorded it. They always did. Within hours, the video spread online, but this time, the narrative was different. The angle was wider. The truth was clearer. People saw the officer who provoked. "I didn't wear that badge to protect lies. I wore it because I believed it meant something." He looked directly into the camera. "If one man's pride can pour coffee on a woman and walk free, then maybe the real stain isn't on her. It's on all of us." The chant that followed began small. One voice, then two, until it filled the air like thunder. "Justice for Margaret! Justice for all!" Inside the station, Price watched from behind the blinds, jaw clenched, pulse hammering. He'd been suspended, yes, but in his mind he'd done nothing wrong. Just another overreaction. Just another crowd looking for a villain. He told himself he'd been provoked, that people were twisting the story. But deep down, something uglier whispered the truth, that he couldn't stand the way she looked at him that day. Calm, steady, unbroken. The kind of strength he'd never understand. Now, that same quiet woman had brought him to his knees without raising her voice, and the town that once called him hero now whispered racist in grocery aisles. He couldn't escape it. Not online, not in public, not even in his own reflection. By the third night, the protests grew louder. A line of officers stood between the crowd and the precinct steps. Rain began to fall again, heavy, relentless, as if the sky itself had been waiting for this moment to break. Margaret hadn't planned to go. But when she heard the noise outside her window, the same chant that carried her name, she couldn't stay still any longer. She took her umbrella, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and walked toward the sound. The streets glowed wet. Beneath the flashing red and blue, lights. People moved aside as she passed, whispers rippling through the crowd. "That's her! That's the woman! She's the one from the video!" She didn't speak. She just kept walking until she reached the front, where Isaiah stood, soaked through, eyes locked on the wall of officers facing them. He turned when he saw her. "Ma, what are you doing here?" being seen," she said softly. Across the line, Price stood rigid, helmet tucked under his arm. He hadn't been ordered there. He came anyway. He wanted to prove something. To himself. To the people watching. To her. When his eyes met hers across the storm of umbrellas and chanting voices, everything else fell away. The noise, the lights, the chaos. It was just them again. The diner. The cup. The silence that started it all, except now. She wasn't sitting. She was standing. Someone shouted in the crowd. A bottle hit the pavement. The line of officers flinched, shields lifting. "Hold position!" a sergeant yelled. Isaiah instinctively stepped in front of his mother, arm outstretched. "Everyone stay calm!" he called, voice echoing over the storm. No one here wants this to turn ugly. But the air had already changed, thick, electric, on the verge of breaking. Price felt it too. The noise, the heat, the pressure. And somewhere in the blur he saw Isaiah move, just slightly, and his hand went to his belt. For a moment, everything slowed. The world seemed to hold its breath. Margaret saw it before anyone else, that familiar twitch of control, that reflex of fear disguised as order. And in that second, all the years of staying silent, of bowing her head, of pretending not to feel, boiled to the surface. She stepped forward, her voice, steady, sharp, carrying through the rain. "Cut the air clean in two. You've taken enough from me. You don't get to take my son, too." The word stopped him cold. The entire crowd froze. Even the rain seemed to pause. Price's hand hovered at his side, fingers trembling. Isaiah's chest rose and fell in short, hard breaths. His arm still protectively across her, and between them, mother, son, oppressor, the truth hung visible, undeniable. This was, "I don't know," she said. "But maybe we just started something that can't be ignored anymore." He nodded slowly. "You know, the way you looked at him, I'll never forget that." She smiled faintly. "Good, neither will he." Across town, in a dim kitchen filled with silence, Price sat staring at the same photograph that had gone viral. He wasn't in uniform anymore. The badge had been suspended, pending further review. But none of that mattered. What haunted him wasn't the public shame. It was her eyes, calm, unbroken, even after everything. For the first time in his life, he saw himself clearly, not as the hero he thought he was, but as the man who needed to break someone to feel powerful. And for the first time, he felt small. He turned the